Welcome to FBNC's May 24th Today's World News. Here are today's hottest and latest news. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov recently said that territories that have become Russian territories are an inseparable part of Russia, and this is not a matter for discussion. In response, Peskov stressed that territories that have become the subject of the Russian Federation have been recorded in the constitution of our country as an inseparable part of Russia. The Kremlin spokesman's speech came after U.S. President Donald Trump said in a government meeting that he wanted Ukraine to win back as many territories as possible in a potential peace agreement with Russia. He said that Moscow would have to give in, but the final agreement needs to bring back the best possible outcome for both if signed. Although there is nothing certain about an agreement, Trump expressed hope that it will come true for the benefit of mankind. He also stressed that if a peace agreement is reached, Ukraine may forget to visit the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Because this is the heart of the conflict, he affirmed that Russia will have to give in. Meanwhile, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that Moscow would reject any ceasefire only aimed at closing the conflict along the current line, leaving some of Russia's territories under Ukraine's control. Lavrov said that some people have proposed to maintain the border between this region of Russia and that region of Ukraine. That will not happen because we have a constitution that reflects the will of the people. At the same time, he reiterated the popular demands in the previous 5 territories of Ukraine. Currently, the Ukrainian side has not spoken out about the above statements of the Russian officials. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea after launching a special military campaign in Ukraine in February 2022. 4 other Ukrainian territories, including Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson, voted to annex Russia. Currently, the Russian military controls a large part of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, as well as part of the territories in Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. Meanwhile, according to a report by the U.S.-based Institute for War Studies, Russia seeks to control Ukraine's cities through a post-apocalyptic approach, not a military measure. However, analysts noted that Russia's military advance has been delayed. The Moscow forces are suffering a significant loss of people and weapons. Therefore, the Kremlin is trying to use foreign pressure and propaganda to force Ukraine to surrender, as well as to give up the right to control its cities. It is known that the Russian military has almost launched a successful attack in the summer of 2025, covering more than 1,000 kilometers and winning some important victories. At the same time, they continue to strike hard to force the Kremlin forces out of the controlled territory. Within 48 hours, the Moscow forces have regained control over 3 important villages. Previously, the Kremlin forces had taken possession of the Everdolikovo settlement, which has a strategic location near the Ukrainian rear highway in the Kursk region. A member of the European Parliament opened a statement saying that U.S. President Donald Trump had given Europe 3 weeks to sign the terms of surrender to Ukraine against Russia. According to Newsweek, observers of the 3-year war in Ukraine were concerned that Trump could reach an agreement with Russian President Vladimir Putin to force Ukraine to give up its desire to join NATO and give up the territories currently occupied by Moscow. This is in fact a surrender in the face of Moscow's claims. In a tweet, a former member of the European Parliament MEP Mika Antula from Finland of the European People's Party stated that the U.S. had given us 3 weeks to sign the terms of surrender to Ukraine, implying a peace agreement to end the war. Antula added that if we don't do that, the U.S. will withdraw from Europe. Previously, David Panay, a former U.S. Defense Department officer, said that President Donald Trump's withdrawal from NATO was a real threat. Panay said that President Trump could withdraw U.S. security guarantees to each country that opposed his peace initiative with Russia to end the Ukrainian conflict, or could threaten to withdraw the U.S. completely from NATO. In fact, Trump considered withdrawing the U.S. from NATO twice during his term as president. He said that the military alliance was out of date, and there was no threat to the U.S. military's presence in Europe. Currently, according to Panay, if the European Union and the United Kingdom try to reverse Trump's peace initiative, the U.S. president is likely to respond. According to Newsweek, observers of the 3-year war in Ukraine were concerned that Trump could reach an agreement with Russian President Vladimir Putin to force Ukraine to give up its desire to join NATO and give up the territories currently occupied by Moscow. This is in fact a surrender in the face of Moscow's claims. In a tweet, a former member of the European Parliament, Mika Antula, from Finland of the European People's Party stated that the U.S. had given us 3 weeks to sign the terms of surrender to Ukraine, implying a peace agreement to end the war. Antula added that if we don't do that, the U.S. will withdraw from Europe. Previously, David Pinay, a former U.S. Defense Department officer, said that President Donald Trump's withdrawal from NATO was a real threat. Pinay said that President Trump could withdraw U.S. security guarantees to each country that opposed his peace initiative with Russia to end the Ukrainian conflict, or could threaten to withdraw the U.S. completely from NATO. In fact, Trump considered withdrawing the U.S. from NATO twice during his term as president. He said that the military alliance was out of date and there was no threat to the U.S. military's presence in Europe. Currently, according to Pinay, if the European Union and the United Kingdom try to reverse Trump's peace initiative, the U.S. president is likely to respond. According to the Wall Street Journal, Ukraine may lose its ability to maintain the current level of combat in the summer if there is no U.S. aid. In another way, Kiev may have to stop fighting if there is a lack of U.S. aid. The Russian forces are increasing their influence in the Donbass region. They have just seized control of the Novo-Andreyevka and Ulagli residential areas of the People's Republics of Donetsk at the end of last week. The Wall Street Journal reported that even the current defense strategy of Kiev may face risks due to the lack of military aid from Washington, which may cause Ukraine to lack ammunition for the high-tech weapons supplied by the United States in the middle of the year. This makes it difficult for Ukraine to maintain the current level of combat in the summer. The change in Washington's foreign policy related to the ongoing conflict forces Kiev to face the prospect of losing U.S. military aid. Ukraine produces about 55% of its military equipment, while the United States supplies 20% and the European Union supplies about 25%. VKFZ quoted a European official named, "The country's domestic arms industry currently produces about $30 billion of weapons a year," according to the news agency. However, Ukraine still relies on the United States for important military supplies such as air defense systems and anti-aircraft missiles, as well as long-range missiles such as the ATAC-MS. Kiev's European allies cannot effectively replace the supplies because they do not produce them or do not produce enough, the newspaper said. VKFZ quoted officials and analysts as saying that if there were no U.S. necessary weapons, Kiev would lose the ability to defend itself next week and carry out long-range attacks. President Donald Trump suspended U.S. military and financial aid to Ukraine on the first day of his term and urged it to stop selling quickly in the conflict. The European Union has recently proposed a new deal with Ukraine on mining and the use of important minerals. The proposal was issued as a replacement for the request of U.S. President Donald Trump, who is seeking access to Ukrainian mineral resources to compensate for U.S. military aid. The European Commission on Industrial Strategy said Ukraine could provide 21 of the 30 important minerals that Europe needs through a mutually beneficial partnership. The Commission also emphasized that the EU would not require a non-beneficial deal for both sides. Unlike the approach of the U.S. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky previously refused to sign 2 drafts of the deal proposed by the Trump administration due to harsh conditions. Zelensky also stated that the deal with the U.S. on the use of Ukraine's natural resources must include clear security guarantees from the U.S. Meanwhile, Trump said that the U.S. was very close to completing a non-beneficial deal with Ukraine and would include rare earths and many other things. However, the EU's proposal is seen as a more positive replacement for Ukraine because it is based on a mutually beneficial partnership and does not require Ukraine to give up its right to control its resources. Ukraine's natural resources, including manganese, titanium, carbon, and lithium, have become the subject of intense negotiations between Kyiv and Washington. Meanwhile, the exploration and use of important resources can bring economic and national security benefits to both Ukraine and the EU. It can be seen that in the context of competition between the EU and the US, on the exploration of Ukraine's resources, the EU's proposal is seen as a more positive choice for Ukraine. This proposal not only helps Ukraine protect its right to control its resources, but also brings economic and national security benefits to both sides. For its part, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov accused the EU of redirecting peace progress in Ukraine by pushing it to continue fighting against Russia. Specifically, At a press conference in Qatar, Lavrov cited a resolution drafted by the U.S. and approved by the Security Council of the United Nations, calling for an end to the conflict in Ukraine. The resolution, which is supported by both Russia and China, has omitted the words of criticism of Moscow. According to Lavrov, when the political power balance related to Ukraine changed, as was clearly seen in the United Nations vote, the EU immediately tried to prevent this trend, announced new large military aid packages for Ukraine, and pushed Kyiv to continue its military actions. The Russian foreign minister said that the role of the EU in provoking the crisis, which has lasted for centuries, has not changed. The approach of the EU to the conflict has been outdated and failed hopelessly. Instead, Moscow believes that the best support is to recognize the cause leading to the confrontation. The cold and harsh messages sent by U.S. President Donald Trump to Ukraine over the past time since he took office have made the Ukrainian leaders realize the fact that the United States is no longer their number one target. The United States could even become an opponent of Ukraine once Washington decides to pursue the goal of ending the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. In the past 2 weeks, President Trump has initiated direct talks with Russia, and on one side of Ukraine's questions, there is a chair in the negotiating table. At the peak of tension, U.S. President Trump even called Ukrainian President Zelensky a dictator. In this situation, although recently the Kiev has indicated that Zelensky is likely to visit Washington soon to meet Trump at the end of February 2022, the Ukrainian leaders still have to come up with other plans to ensure their own security. Analysts and Ukrainian officials say that this country has some plans, but the number is very limited, and there is no solution at all. First, they can find a way to win Trump's favor by accepting economic agreements that are beneficial to the U.S. to replace the U.S. military aid. If this plan does not succeed, the U.S. military aid capacity for Ukraine will run out soon. In the meantime, Ukraine may only be able to maintain war for a few more months. Second, Ukraine may, and in fact have begun to shift to Europe as the closest new partner and a potential security guarantor. In recent days, President Zelensky has attended several phone calls and direct meetings with his European counterparts to discuss increasing military aid to Ukraine, including the ability to deploy peacekeeping forces on the ground. On February 24th at the White House, President Macron also raised the case of Ukraine, hoping to receive support from the U.S. Meanwhile, Eleonora Getmanchuk, the head of the New Europe Center, a research institute based in Kiev, who was chosen by Zelensky as Ukraine's next ambassador to NATO, said that adapting to the new situation was difficult for Ukrainians. In fact, right after Trump re-elected the U.S. president, Ukraine tried to approach President Trump's business mind. Ukraine has proposed a deal to allow the U.S. to access its important minerals, rare earths that need high-tech equipment, to replace Washington's support for Kiev. However, Trump suddenly asked for a $500 billion, including minerals and oil, but did not promise Ukraine any security guarantees. Getmanchuk said that if Kiev did not cooperate in the effort to reach a peace deal, Trump would not be able to become a great peacemaker like he himself and fall into the trap. He needs Zelensky to complete the mission of maintaining peace. Experts say that although it is the end, Ukraine can still decide to continue or not. The question is, how long will Kiev hold the election after the U.S. cuts all aid for Ukraine? According to military analysts, although difficult, Ukraine still has some advantages. For example, Ukraine has increased its ability to produce domestic weapons and has been able to create almost all the UAVs it has deployed on the battlefield. The UAV is Ukraine's main vehicle to attack Russian troops at this stage. According to Solomya Poprovskaya, a member of Ukraine's Defense and Intelligence Committee, Ukraine's defense industry has about 40% of Ukraine's arms demand. However, Ukraine's most promising plan may be to withdraw to the European Union. Some European countries have begun to provide financial support to Ukraine's defense industry. The EU is discussing a plan to send Ukraine a package of new aid with a total value of about $21 billion. In recent days, U.S. President Donald Trump's administration has repeatedly said that Europe must strengthen its own security guarantee and be a defender of Ukraine's peace. According to Reuters, candidate for Prime Minister Friedrich Musk of the Socialist Union CDU-CSU just won the German parliamentary election, stressing that the above request shows that Trump does not care about the security of Europe. One day after the victory, Musk warned that the U.S. should not turn its back on its allies, and also called on Europeans to build their own defense capabilities. Recently, German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock said that the European Union needs to set up its own defense fund to contribute to the strengthening of security and defense capabilities. She argued that this would be an important step to strengthen the EU's stability agreement and growth so that member states can continue to increase defense spending. This is why we need a European defense fund that can meet the challenge. At the same time, Prime Minister of the Czech Republic also called on Europe to protect its own strategic interests and pay more attention to security because long-term electricity cannot depend too much on the U.S. According to him, at the unusual meeting of the European Council on March 6th, European leaders will try to make some decisions regarding the security of electricity. Prime Minister Fiala emphasized that Brazil needs to continue to take care of its own defense and security and gradually increase defense spending to 3% of GDP in a few years. Meanwhile, in the UK, Prime Minister Keir Starmer set a time frame to increase defense spending to 2.5% GDP before 2027. Currently, the UK spends 2.3% of GDP on defense. Nevertheless, EU countries still have many opposing opinions about the EU's priority in defense spending, mainly due to differences in how it approaches defense cooperation and global trade policies. The EU is facing a budget deficit of 500 billion euros in the next decade to continue to support Ukraine and enhance its defense capabilities. However, the bloc has not yet made a commitment to provide 1 million euros of defense spending to Ukraine in March 2024, when it only produced half of it. At the same time, some intelligence reports warn that the EU may face serious security challenges before 2030. French President Emmanuel Macron emphasized the need to increase domestic production. How can the EU produce more? How can the bloc invest more? How can the bloc invest more on defense sexism versus U.S.'s VP Volodymyr Zelensky, U.S. Korea, U.S. Korea, U.S. Greenpeace? Speaking at a press conference in Kiev earlier this week, the Ukrainian president warned countries with Russian roots or historical ties that were within the scope of the Soviet Union's influence that they could be the next target. Zelensky said that Putin could guide the emergence of the Russian-speaking ethnic group as a basis for a military campaign, similar to the 2014 Crimea invasion. The Ukrainian leader said that Estonia, Latvia, Poland, Moldova, and Slovakia are targets that Russia is likely to target once Ukraine collapses. Zelensky stressed that Russia is not occupying our territory and that it is only protecting Russian-speaking countries. Zelensky said that if we collapse, I think all the countries I've just mentioned are at risk of Russian policy. According to Miro, Latvia, Estonia, and Moldova were previously part of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. Latvia and Estonia are home to hundreds of thousands of Russian-speaking people. Moldova also has a significant number of Russian residents. However, Russia will have to face a significant barrier because 4 of the 5 countries mentioned by Zelensky are NATO members. According to NATO regulations, all member states must provide military assistance to any member state that is attacked. NATO has long described Russia as a direct threat to its existence after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Western officials have repeatedly said that if Moscow wins the Ukrainian conflict, it can attack other European countries. Russian President Vladimir Putin has denied these claims, stressing that Russia is not in any interest in doing so. He accused NATO leaders of trying to scare their people with an imaginary threat. But the smart people understand very clearly that this is not true. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump has changed his stance on Russia. He even called Zelensky a dictator and even criticized Ukraine for taking part in the war. He also pushed Ukraine out of peace talks, choosing to initiate direct talks with Russia without inviting representatives from Kiev or Europe. He continued to undermine Zelensky's role by hinting that the Ukrainian leader is not important enough to attend peace talks.